The first writers in residence came to the James Merrill House 25 years ago, shortly after James Merrill's death in 1995. Since then, over 80 writers have visited, staying in his home, a National Historic Landmark, to work on projects of their own. Thanks to Merrill's generosity, the house now belongs to the Stonington Village Improvement Association and is an ongoing inspiration for writers and poets from around the world. For more information, visit our website, jamesmerrillhouse.org. Thank you.
So, hi. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Bergen. It is lovely to see the James Merrill hidden study of 107 behind you. It's very nostalgic.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So this is my new book. It's called The Math Campers.
My own novel. It's called These Women.
It looks like this.
Well, the first thing I'll say is all the dreams are actual dreams. There's nothing worse than a fabricated dream. You can always tell.
I normally don't write in first person because of the fact that as soon as you have a narrator, you tend to have somebody listening, or there's an implied audience.
I just got to soak up in the atmosphere in that house. You just feel like a writer, and you feel like you're part of this tradition in a community, and it feels like the work is important.
Magical things happen when you're looking at Merrill's books.
Well, it was a really, really transformative residency for me. It might sound like a bit of an overstatement, but it really wasn't.
Merrill's really distinct imagination was present in every detail.
Thanks, Brendan. Bye. Enjoy Stonington on my behalf.
Good afternoon. This is Willard Spiegelman. I'm a member of the James Merrill House Committee. It's a cold night at 107 Water Street here in Stonington, but we are warmed inside by the presence, always the presence of James Merrill himself, and by the presence of the latest Merrill Fellow, Christopher Spaide. Chris Spaide is a polymath, a poet, a critic, a person of letters, a musician, a philosopher, and he's an alumnus of Amherst College, which has, of course, many reverberations for us here. Amherst was not only the alma mater of James Merrill, but it's also been associated for so long with writers and the writing life that we can think of it as really the alma mater of much 20th century poetry and poets writing. Not just James Merrill, but of course other presiding deities like Robert Frost and Emily Dickinson, who were not alumni, but they were there. And then within the last century, people like Richard Wilbur, David Ferry, Reuben Brower, Richard Poirier, moving up into our time, Jonathan Post, Michael Gora, Dan Chazen, David Lawrence, and Tess Taylor. Chris is going to talk to us tonight, read from and improvise a little bit from his new book called Lyric Togetherness, about matters of plurality, we's and us's in contemporary poetry. His poems and other writing have appeared in Ploughshares, Poetry, the Yale Review, and the New Yorker, and he's going off in many interesting directions. Let me give you two pieces of business before we hand it over to Chris. First of all, if you are logging on and you can see, as I do on my screen, the comment section, feel free to write in a comment, or even better, a question, so that we can include the question and the comments in the general discussion at the end of the session. And the second thing from our fearless leader, Bergen, Bergen O'Malley, a reminder that on Tuesday, the 29th of November, Chris will be leading a poetry workshop here downstairs at 107 Water Street in the Visitor Center called Lost and Found in Translation. And that will be from 5:30 to 6:30 on Tuesday, the 29th of November. And following the session, there will be drinks and merriment until about 7 o'clock or so. The subject will be found poems, poems that have been found and written by poets like Tracy Smith, Natalie Shapiro, and Solmaz Sharif, and also poems that will be found and improvised and put together by the members of the workshop themselves, of whom there will be only 8. Seating does not exceed that. Anyway, that is my introduction to young Dr. Spaide, who will now take over and let us hear from him. Chris?
Thanks so much, Willard. And just to keep in the key of Thanksgiving for a few minutes, let me thank some others. My heartfelt thanks to everyone at the James Merrill House, the co-chairs, the board of directors, the irrepressibly musical Bergen O'Malley, without whom I literally would not be inside right now. And again, the magnificent Willard, whom I'm happy to call my temporary neighbor. As a newcomer to the borough, I have a hard time telling where the Merrill community ends and the rest of Stonington begins. I think I'm happy not knowing, if any hard line would excuse or exclude the town's affable dogs, its confident outdoorsy cats, and the sculptural gizmos in the visiting center downstairs, made by Dan Potter. So I'll just thank all the people and the non-people for welcoming me here today. Most of my reading today will concern James Merrill, a poet I never met, but I sometimes wonder if I would have walked by him on a Manhattan street in the early 90s. Although I probably wouldn't have walked, I probably would have strollered or toddled by him. The first few years of my life, which were the last few years of his, I grew up on 72nd Street and York Avenue, just 4 avenue blocks down from his last apartment in the city, which was 164 East 72nd Street. And I'll show you a little bit of a poem. I have some slides for today that is there any way I can get these on? 1 second. Here we go. In a late wistful poem named for his last address, Merrill fondly ribs our common stomping grounds, the Upper East Side. Quote, far from those parts of town given to high finance, or the smash hit and steakhouse, Macy's or crack, Saks or quick sex, this neighborhood saunters blandly forth, adjusting its clothing. Those are not words I would have understood at age 2 when the poem came out, but I recognize the place retrospectively. Whether or not I could have run into Merrill, I never read his poetry until college and graduate school. And for sharing that poetry with me, I'm indebted to a brilliant constellation of professors at Amherst College. That would be Helen von Schmidt, David Sofield, the late Richard Wilbur, and most of all, Daniel Hall, who shepherded a flock of us poets down to Stonington, myself included, 11 years ago. At Harvard, that would be my advisors, Stephanie Burt, Peter Sachs, Jory Graham, and Helen Bendler. So my deepest thanks to all of them. This talk is for them. So hi, my name is Chris. I'm a scholar, critic, and poet, currently a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. And today I'm going to read an excerpt from my academic book in progress, Lyric Togetherness, Saying We in Post-War American Poetry. Afterwards, time permitting, I'll read a poem or two of my own. Like many academic books about literature, mine has too many words in the title and at least 1 colon, but it's trying to answer a pretty simple question. Why have so many poets, writing since World War II, decided to speak for other people? Reduced to 2 words, how come so much recent American poetry is about we instead of I or me? That's how I explain the book to casual readers of poetry and poets, but it's also how I explain the book to scholars of poetry, for whom the words I and we carry special intellectual heft. The poetry we call lyric poetry, as opposed to narrative or dramatic poetry, the poetry of the lyre, from which we get lyric, it's supposed to be a one-man show, a one-person show. If you trust its best-known definitions, lyric poetry is the genre of the self, the soul, the solitary speaker, the single consciousness, or what students and teachers have called for decades, the lyric I, an entire mode of poetry squished into one thin letter. That definition works for many of poetry's dashing figures, its romantics, its prophets, its confessionalists. But it sells short the many poets in our era who endeavored to speak for all of us, our identities, our communities, even our entire species. The history of those poets spans from W.H. Auden's wartime universals, lines like "We must love one another or die," all the way to the latest poems on the pandemic, with countless moments and movements in between. Adrienne Rich's feminist art, A.R. Ammons's universalizing poems of science, the Black arts movement, its offshoots and its detractors, and Asian American poets satirizing white America. In my book's last chapters, I turn to what poets and scholars now call eco-poetry, poetry with an environmental awareness and ecological concern greater than the telescoped focus of traditional nature poetry. It's there that I discuss a poet who is not yet heralded as one of the earth-moving eco-poets of his generation, and that poet is James Merrill. We tend to introduce Merrill through his autobiographical lyric poems, what he once called his chronicles of love and loss. Or else, with the clear eyes of distance, we read Merrill's career backward, starting with his late encrypted poetry about AIDS, which faithfully records the body's deteriorations, the heart's chambered secrecies, and the mind's unquenchable inventions. What we don't commonly say about Merrill is this: the same magazines that published his much-loved poems about art and ardor, travel and opera, were the same magazines that published his poems on environmental topics more pressing now than ever: global warming, species extinction, bleached corals, melting ice caps, radioactive contamination, and the depredations of the fossil fuel industry. Years before the front page brought you the latest on overfished waters and overfarmed fields, you could read about them in Merrill's bracing poems. Even in the 80s, Merrill could match today's doomiest pronouncements, saying that, quote, nature is dead, or soon will be, or that we're heading towards an apocalypse of, quote, dead land, waste water, sulfur sky. Over his last decade of writing, he would stretch his range beyond these pitch black tones, writing eco-poetry with the full chromatic scale of the human voice, lamenting and lullabying, whining and wisecracking, self-accusing and self-deluding. On November 2nd, the day I arrived in Stonington, the high was 68 degrees. By the 5th, it had reached a record-breaking 72. Like any good tourist, I went down to Stonington Point each evening to take Instagrammable photos of the incandescent sunset, rake my toes through the sand and surf, and joke with elated passersby about global warming, the easiest way to choke down the nervous lump in the throat. Merrill's poetry, I find, does justice to conflicted moments like these, to our amicable feelings about an off-kilter planet. The critic Randall Jarrell said of Wallace Stevens' last poems that they, quote, show better than any other poems, perhaps, what the world looks like as we leave it. Merrill's eco-poetry, you could say, shows what we look like as our collective toll leaves the world irreparably changed. My description of Merrill might not sound so shocking if you've read his best readers, people like Stephen Yunser, Helen Vendler, and Langdon Hammer. But surely it would have bewildered his first readers of his first poems that went out of their way not to pontificate on global crises or the nature of man. Merrill's first poems, true to 50s house style, were more comfortable slipping into the pronoun we than pronouncing a distinct I. But as Merrill recalled in a 1968 interview, he was speaking for his social circle, not his species. Quote, A generation ago, we was the pronoun, Merrill self-teasingly reflected, tracing the fad to Auden's sense of a political elite or Rilke's elite of sufferers. But maybe he mused, the two we's are one. As Merrill developed into an unmistakable verse memoirist and cast an urbane eye as his lifework's protagonist, he never shed those elite associations. Even when he meets the American public face to face, as on the Manhattan streets of his early poem, An Urban Convalescence, he balks at the idea of speaking for those publics in their prosaic language. Let's take a look at that poem's crux. Here, Merrill finds himself lapsing into think piece cliche, grimly diagnosing what he calls the sickness of our time. A stanza later, he's already rolling his eyes. Quote, there are certain phrases which to use in a poem is like rubbing silver with quicksilver, Merrill, becoming his own editor, explains. Then he takes this very poem to task. Quote, for instance, how the sickness of our time enhances, then debases what I feel. The sickness of our time, the generational condition, is bad enough. But the sickness of our time, that lazy phrase, that's simply unbearable. Hence Merrill's revision in real time, the poetic equivalent of a gag reflex. For decades hereafter, Merrill would rank the fine-grained articulation of his subjectivity, what I feel, over the generalizing treatment of collective ills, the sickness of our time. In another interview from '68, he admitted, quote, we all have our limits. I draw the line at politics or hippies. I'd rather present the world through, say, a character's intelligence or lack of it than through any sort of sociological prism. The same goes in Merrill's early work for the natural world. Filtered through his intelligence or lack of it, nature comes out pruned and stylized, a bonsai of itself. Consider one of Merrill's mid-career triumphs, a sonnet sequence of family romance and self-analysis called The Broken Home. In its sixth sonnet, Merrill asks why, quote, I rarely buy a newspaper or vote. He traces that apolitical, even agoraphobic sensibility to the divorce of two headline-making parents, mythologized as Father Time and Mother Earth. Sealing off from the world with a rusted bolt, Merrill aspires neither to Father Time's history-making business nor to Mother Earth's oneness with nature. Instead, he'll cultivate something small, domestic, poem-sized. Quote, nor do I try to keep a garden, only an avocado in a glass of water, roots pallid, gemmed with air. And later, when the small gilt leaves have grown fleshy and green, I let them die, yes, yes, and start another. I am Earth's no less. How, in this trauma-haunted poem, have we gotten to an avocado seed? As ever in Merrill's orchestral sequences, the figure harmonizes with everything around it. As a teenage science project carried well into one's 30s, the seed is an emblem of an arrested adolescence. But it's also a queer, almost DIY parody of heterosexual reproduction and of Merrill's own broken home. This seed, unlike him, finds growth in rupture. Lastly, it suggests that this poet wants his nature like his art, contained, ornamentally gemmed and gilt, and replaceable. Nature here is the belonging of a human caretaker who is fixated on his own pallid roots, his familial roots, his psychic roots. Someone who can still sympathize, though I am Earth no less. The mystery overshadowing Merrill's career is how the early, worldly, self-skeptical poet of poems like these came to write The Changing Light at Sandover, a divine comedy founded on the 26 characters of the Ouija board, plus 0 through 9, yes, and no, not to mention a toolkit of other words and punctuation. The enormousness of that 17,000-line mystery often eclipses Merrill's later books, including a landmark text of eco-poetry, his last collection, A Scattering of Salts, published weeks after he died. There it is. These late works are themselves difficult to see clearly, clouded by mysteries all their own. Why did Merrill, once proud to draw the line at politics, become so attracted to front-page political topics and ecological issues distant from the mainstream? No longer a broken homebody tending to an avocado, how did he widen his lyrics aperture to take in a biodiverse planet, threatened ecosystems, and urban pollution? Why, finally, did this poet of a lavishly outfitted lyric eye take it upon himself to speak for we? No longer the elite we of his early work, but the global we of a dangerous and endangered human collectivity. No single autobiographical key slides neatly into these mysteries and unlocks them completely. When scholars attempt to explain Merrill's ecological curiosity, certain things come up again and again. The changing light at Sandover and its cosmological understitching, which connects all living things, the variegated land and seascapes of Merrill's travel, his premature mortality due to AIDS and the metaphors that illness presented for a ravaged earth, and finally, his growing faith in materials science and the genetic underpinnings that we all share. Personally, I've always found these explanations a bit lacking. Merrill turned so sharply to eco-poetry, decades before so many of his peers, that I assumed there must be some story behind it, yet to be uncovered. One reason I wanted to come here to the James Merrill House was to search for clues, leads on the unsolved mystery of Merrill's eco-poetry. Call it not a whodunit, but a how'd he do it. Amazingly, I have found clues, just not for the puzzles I was trying to solve. To stray off topic a bit, the first essay I ever published on Merrill was about his poems on what he would have called the Orient, East and South Asia, the Middle East, and the sprawl of the former Ottoman Empire. Unlike most know-it-all Americans who write about the East, Merrill knows how little he knows. His East is always warped, projected onto, commodified, never the real thing that Westerners hope to encounter. If I had any doubts before this trip about the importance of the East to Merrill's writing and thinking, it took a few days in this apartment to dispel them. Just take a look. In his study, I found travel guides and phrase books from his around-the-world trip in the 50s, complete with itineraries, train times, and tips from locals. In my essay, I compare Merrill to Roland Barthes and his meditation on Japan, Empire of Signs. I was stunned to find in Merrill's study 2 copies of the book, one in French and one in English. On the 4th floor, I found a personal copy of Merrill's ballad, The Summer People, which has a regrettable Asian caricature. But it was handwritten on a Japanese accordion book so long I had to stand up on a chair to unfold it fully. So I think it's maybe 9 feet. And then finally, within eyeshot of the stove where I've been making coffee and tea all month, I found this. William Plomer's biography of the Albanian ruler Ali Pasha, The Diamond of Yanina, which Merrill mined for his majestic travel poem, Yanina. I flipped it open. On the front cover, James Merrill, 1971. On the back cover, page numbers penciled in Merrill's hand, pointing to every passage indispensable to the poem. I found the book on my first night here. Detective work shouldn't be this easy. If my time here really were a literary mystery novel, I'd take issue with the author for bad writing. So, was I so lucky with the mystery of Merrill's eco-poetry? No, not in the same effortless way. There were no dog-eared textbooks on environmental science, no nonfiction by John McPhee or Bill McKibben, no drawer clogged with startling news clippings. What I did find could fit on a few side tables. Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us, not far from this illustrated guide to tropical fish. Books on devastation and mid-century doomsaying, including this beach read of a book, The End of the World, A Scientific Inquiry. Scattered books on the crossroads of science and literature. And finally, a good shelf full of books by path-breaking eco-poets, A.R. Ammons, W.S. Merwin, and Gary Snyder. Turtle Island, you may know, includes environmental essays at the back. What those books told me more than anything was not to look for books. The learning of Merrill's late poetry must have come elsewhere, from newspapers and TV, friends, and firsthand witnessing. More telling than any book, it turned out, was just the apartment itself, a live-in cabinet of natural and artificial curiosities. Take this arrangement right outside Meryl's bedroom. We have a poet's laurel wreath, spray-painted gold, 2 fans ornamented with peacock feathers, and behind them a trio of metallic peacock miniatures. And then you can barely make it out, but we have a seashell riding a carved wooden turtle, like a settlement atop Turtle Island. All of this was evidence of a curatorial appreciation of nature, a collecting impulse, something that corresponds maybe to the shut-in of the broken home, or to the bourgeois self that Walter Benjamin calls the private individual, whose domestic sphere is his universe. As Benjamin writes, quote, "His living room is a box in the theater of the world." Nothing could be further from the unselective worldview of the poems I was thinking about. Those poems taken the man-made alongside the non-human, the terrible next to the tasteful. To write those poems, I realized Merrill had to breach the limits of his self-made world. Literally, he had to go outside. Imaginatively, he had to think beyond the grand ballroom of his capacious mind. By excavating Merrill's house, in short, I was looking in precisely the wrong place. If satisfying explanations for Merrill's eco-poetry were anywhere, they were in paths traced by the poems themselves, and nowhere more evidently than A Scattering of Salts. For all his titles, Merrill cherished multifaceted phrases, sparkling with multiple meanings. With A Scattering of Salts, he seized on a phrase at once suggestively vague and vividly gestural that encompassed any number of finishing touches: a seasoning of a meal, a sprinkling of bath salts, a showering of preservatives or embalming chemicals, and finally a shedding of tears. These meanings resonate with our prevailing sense of this book as a work of mourning for close friends and above all for Merrill himself, who encoded his AIDS diagnosis by projecting his mortality onto an ailing earth. But further meanings, radiantly clear in retrospect, make Merrill's small-scale scatterings rhyme with global dispersals. The dissolution of salts through oceans, the pollution of ecosystems with foreign waste, and even a planet-sized rendition of that ancient military ritual, the conquerors cursing the conquered by sowing the earth with salt. All of these meanings aren't mine. They're Merrill's own finds, strewn about for readers like us to chance upon ourselves. Take An Upward Look, the book's final farewell. It addresses a molecular compound of nouns, O heart green acre, that is at once internal and external, integral and piecemeal. O heart green acre, sown with salt by the departing occupier, lay down your gallant spears of wheat, salt of the earth, each stellar pinch flung in blind defiance backwards, now takes its toll. Salt, that glittering figure, sustains this poem's delicate balance between personal and global. If the one departing is a lover, a word that shows up in the 7th line of the poem, if it's a lover, a former occupier of a mind or a bedroom, then the heart green acre is presumably tear-stained with salt. It's an acre in 2 senses, something aching with grief. But if the occupier is the species Homo sapiens, the earth is not only sown with salt, but corroded by self-serving humankind, as we cultivate spears of wheat, only to make them lay down. Salt of the earth, that reconstituted cliche, suits a down-on-his-luck lover's toss of a stellar pinch over the shoulder, but it could also describe some vaster catastrophe, something earth-wide, as the legacy of blind, disregarding devastation now takes its toll. Why does Merrill write this in these fractured phrases, riddled with gasps and gaps? You could conclude that he's chosen a form that mirrors the dire predicaments of life right now. But if you happen to remember your Beowulf, and I do recommend it if you haven't, it's a 5-star read, you might recognize Merrill's form as Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse, English's oldest way of stitching sounds together. Not with rhymes, but with repeated stressed consonants, flung in blind defiance backwards, FB, FB. Merrill's Upward Look, then, surveys a millennium of human making, from the origin of poetry in English all the way to our present state of jeopardy. Not that Merrill has any solutions in store. At the close of an upward look, which is a close of the book and hence the close of his book-bound career, the salt crystal morphs one last time into a salt of the sky. Like the planet Venus, it is a morning star daily dissolving into dawn, and an evening star nightly recrystallizing from inmost depths of clear dark blue. Again, Merrill is both looking ahead and thinking back, this time to the literary convention with the prettiest name, stellification, the transformation of something into an everlasting star. Until Merrill's reimagining, Helen Vendler writes that stellification, quote, had never chosen as its vehicle a crystal of salt, the salt of bodily fluids, of tears, of savor. Viewed in light of his mounting ecological concern, Merrill's stellification looks like a wishful flight from human and planetary scales, inward to the sturdy ionic lattice of salt, NaCl, and outward to the persistent, predictable orbits of the stars. If only we had the security of a microcosm or a macrocosm, but it's our fate to live in between. Turn back a page from an upward look, and you'll find a poem with a baffling title, a collision of artistic tradition and modern branding. It's called Self-Portrait in Tyvek Windbreaker. Here it is as it first appeared in the New Yorker. Like the earlier poem, An Urban Convalescence, it traces a walk in Manhattan, but it reaches the opposite conclusion about Merrill's relationship to the sickness of our time. Shocked into solidarity by global threats and our collective non-response, the once singular poet realizes he's just like everyone else. I'm going to end on this long, sarcastic, prophetic poem, among Merrill's greatest. Even at 30 years old, it still captures the contradictory textures of life on an imperiled planet, its seamless continuities, its unnerving warps, its tumultuous ruptures. Across these 18 stanzas, its hodgepodge, high meets low catalogs touch on everything from eco-saints to the greenhouse effect, dead forests to Oprah. But it begins with Merrill showing off his spiffy new jacket. Quote, "The windbreaker is white with a world map. DuPont contributed the seeming frail, unrippable stuff first used for priority mail. Weightless as shores reflected in deep water, the countries are violet, orange, yellow, green. Names of the principal towns and rivers, black. A zipper's hiss, and the Atlantic Ocean closes over my blood-red t-shirt from the Gap." With that perfect rhyme of world map and the Gap, Merrill's first stanza zips shut the superimposed scales of contemporary life. We have the body, from its blood-red interior to its kaleidoscopic outward style. The linguistic, in the names printed across the torso and down the sleeves. We have the apparently natural, weightless as shores reflected in deep water. And then we have the unrippably artificial. We have the national in those countries, but then the multinational in DuPont's corporate sprawl. Lastly, we have the global, cut to flattering proportions. It'll be his postmodern jester's outfit, or else his post-religious death shroud. Incredibly, for a prop so perfectly tailored for Merrill's poetic purposes, it's a real jacket. First released in 1989 under the sweetly kitschy name Where in the World. That's Wherein, Wearin apostrophe, the world. I happen to have it. This is my big prop for the day. I'm not going to put it on. This is not the one Merrill had. It's one I found on eBay during the first year of COVID. Maybe I can answer questions about it later. But everything he says about it, more or less, in the poem is true. One thing he doesn't mention that you'll see if you try to buy one online is that it really does feel like paper, and it's sometimes advertised as a paper jacket. So when you wear it, it really does feel like you're wearing a poem around. Two stanzas midway through the poem find Merrill deftly slipping from wry introversion to species thinking and back, from I to we to I. Merrill is busy styling himself a campy everyman for a globalized age, strutting around town with his eye-catching jacket and yellow plastic Walkman. Abruptly, things fall flat. In a bit of everyday absurdity you can imagine playing out in Seinfeld, which was then in its third season, Meryl finds out he's not the only New Yorker who's wearing the world. Oh, this is actually not who I had in mind, but this is one reason the jacket's so expensive, because Kurt Cobain wore it once. James Merrill's name does not show up in the advertisements, which is a tragedy. Here's what I wanted to read. Every man, c'est moi, the whole world's pal. The pity is how soon such feelings sour. As I leave the gym, a smiling as if I should know her teenager, oh, but I mean she's wearing our windbreaker, and assumes. Yet I return her wave like an accomplice. For while all humans aren't countable as equals, we must behave as if they were, or the spirit dies. Pascal. Moments after Jim leaves the gym, he leaves behind a lot more. His comfort within his freshly exercised body, his distinctive outerwear, the specificity of his lyric eye. That waving and smiling as if I should know her teenager drags Meryl into a plural hour, supposing some rapport thanks entirely to their common purchase, our windbreaker. And though he has sour feelings, Meryl can't deny it. He belongs to those senses of community. Returning the teenager's wave, he realizes that he too is an accomplice in consumerism. A sentence later, he broadens out even further, from the conniving we of two like-minded customers to Blaise Pascal's moral and universal we. But he's skeptical of that vaguely bounded collectivity, and he opens his next stanza on a bilingual pun. We, the English pronoun, and we, the French word for yes. We? Really? We, Pascal? What follows ranks among the most slippery passages that Meryl ever wrote, so I would just keep an eye on where this 8-line stanza begins and where it ends, and I'll try to take you through it. Quote, we? A few hundred decades of relative lucidity glinted through by minuscules between us and the red genetic muck. Every man's underpainting. We look up, shy creatures from our trembling pool of sky, caught wet-lipped in light's brushwork, fleet but sure, flash on shutter, folk of the first fuck, likeness breathes likeness, fights for breath. I live where the crush thickens. Here's one tour through Meryl's onrush of music and metaphor. Waving away Pascal's collectivity of the spirit, Meryl turns to the materially grounded collectivity of our shared genetic heritage. Our generations, our species, are only a few hundred decades away from our most rudimentary ancestors, the red genetic muck that underpins or underpaints our evolved present. And we humans are nothing exceptional. Our lucidity is merely relative, and, in a pun, we can count all other life forms as our relatives, even those glinting minuscules. All of us are earthbound, under a ceiling of atmospheric sky. Like any species, humans are limited only by our trembling pool of genes. Except we're also limited by biological imperatives that leave us wet-lipped with desire, abasing us, even one as sophisticated as Meryl, into gruntingly alliterative folk of the first fuck. Impulsively, we continue to breathe or breed likeness from likeness, even as the crush of overpopulation thickens. In an ingenious twist, Meryl's most general statements about human propagation beget a lyric I live. Closing on that bare existential utterance, Meryl implies that the epochal history of terrestrial life rests on the individual and its building blocks: will, consciousness, sensation, and voice. In 8 lines, Meryl can acknowledge his part in a millennia-old biological project, and he can still utter, in his inimitable way, I live. Yet I live cannot have the final word. Not of this self-portrait of a dying, childless man, nor of this panorama of an erratic earth, where no one person stands for much. Meryl closes his self-portrait by addressing a fellow artist, the musician playing on his Walkman all poem long, the Neapolitan singer Roberto Marolo. You can hear it in their common consonants. Marolo is Meryl's mirror, an artist, quote, bearing the old songs of the land into the nuclear age, all to make nature's lamps burn brighter. Just like Merrill, this kindred artist is unequipped to resolve the poem's chilling questions and ecological dread. Don't ask, Roberto, Merrill requests as he builds to the poem's conclusion. Sing our final air. What follows right here are the poem's final lines, exactly as they appeared in Merrill's last book. Love, grief, etc. For good reason. Now only stop signs. Meanwhile, if you or I've exceeded our more than time was needed to fit a text airless and, as Tyvek, with breathing spaces and between the lines, days brilliantly recurring, as once we did, to keep the blue wave dancing in its prison. True to Merrill's uncertainties, this final stanza is published in this unfinished form. It is a perpetual draft, ornamented with a struck-through phrase. Oh, sorry, I left that out of the slide. More than time is supposed to be cut out. Ornamented with a struck-through phrase, a broken rhyme word, and bracing his fragments against collapse, a range of placeholders, etc., a question mark, those space-taking stars. All this haphazardness, of course, is wholly deliberate. What looks sloppiest in this is precisely what's letter perfect. Fittingly for this dying man, the phrase more than time is crossed out. Merrill's actual edits to self-portrait have been preserved in archives and they're available online. All his last edits, it turns out, concentrate on the ending's pronouns. With one pen stroke to a late typescript, Merrill revises your final air addressed to Marollo to the inclusive our final air. That darkly witty phrase, final air, can mean either a show-stopping song or aria, or our thinning atmosphere. Neither one, Merrill realized in revision, belongs to Marollo alone. They're both ours. And in his very last edit, conceived between the poem's appearance in the New Yorker and its inclusion in his last book, Merrill heightened the mystery by adding a quasi-algebraic phrase, our question mark. Our what? A threshold that's exceeded? An earth green no more, once seeded and now exceeded? Or a responsibility simply ceded, left aside? With that open-ended phrase, Merrill affirms his sense of our collective possessiveness to the very end. He leaves it to the future, to us, to ask and answer what that fading possession might be. So that's it for my talk. And maybe it's pretty hard to follow that act. I do have some poems, and maybe I'll read just one, and then one or two, and then maybe we can take some questions after. So from Merrill, I picked up a love of sonnets, and puns too, and this one will give you both. It's a poem called Fair Trade Sonnet, and it's a poem about, bargains you might or might not be willing to make. It appeared in Ploughshares earlier this year. Fair Trade Sonnet. A horse, my dumb king for a horse. My brand new horse, the naysaying centrist, for state senate. The swayed back seat of my 1,000 horsepower hearse for a spare 10,000 hours to practice basic survival. The fine art of making a slow exit look painless. My last supper for an everlasting grain of salt to dose my days with flavor. Act now, and they'll toss in tasting notes for savoring every hand that feeds you. One pinch of insult per punch of injury. Those better selves were forever beta testing. I'm selling mine for parts. My collected minutiae, my C minor mind, my minus sign smile, my, I would lose it all. Pawn the nearest forest for its trees. Trade in used gods for new models. On your command, I'd forfeit my firstborn, in whose colorless eyes I could be fairest of them all. To be fair, I always wanted to be fair. What is there to say? I traded want away. I went with fear. Maybe I'll read one more. I never had a chance to meet the late James Longenbach, a poet and critic who lived here in the borough. He was one of my intellectual heroes, both for poetry and criticism. Everything I've heard about him in town just makes me miss him more. And I wrote this poem after he passed away earlier this year, after I saw someone tweet, which is also, I don't know, a thing of the past, Jim, you will be missed. And I couldn't not mishear mist as mist. So this is a poem called Mist. In memoriam, James Longenbach. Jim, you will be missed. The river's wide exhalation billowing into chilliness, filmy opacity amassed from detachment, a body of water dissected in midair, daring to shroud the shore with a grounded cloud of standing tears. You will be mystifying, flying in the clean-cut face of basic geometry, a variable gray area between the clear and the irrecoverable, gradient layered disinterestedly as lint to grace each sight sees with change, mossing the mossed rocks, mazing between mast-high hickories. You will be mistaken for missing, but must be here, suspended, a fine phase sifted into a drift that's past catching, a final draft in circulation, still. You will be mistimed, too recent to be past, too hazy for midday's translucence. At least the future, passive, listens for what's lost. You will be missed. Thanks.
I am left speechless by the performance, for which many thanks. There are a couple of questions that appear, but I'm going to take the host's prerogative of asking one or two first. And one of them is something that came to me when you were looking for causes or explanations of Merrill's turn at the end to a broader, maybe populist, maybe ecological poetry. And one thing that came to my mind, and you could check this with somebody like Lanny Hammer or anybody who knows the biography better than I, is that this was the influence of Merrill's last lover, Peter Hooton, who alerted him to popular culture, both the best and the worst parts of it, and who made him a kind of more hail fellow in the world of contemporary politics, which he, Merrill, really had no interest in before he met Peter. Does that sound plausible to you?
It does. And I mean, generally, when I've tried to puzzle this out for myself, how Merrill went from actively scorning political or environmental issues to jumping all the way in, I do wonder if it's the people in his life that opened it out for him. If someone like the painter David McIntosh showed him a vista in the Southwest that just Merrill had never seen before. It's not often that poets out of nowhere develop a massive knowledge and interest about something. Most eco poets we know, they're rugged cowboys in the hills. They're strapping. Gary Snyder still is very strapping in his 90s. They study science like Ed Roberson, but Merrill's really did seem to come out of nowhere. So I wonder if it was the ardor for a person or the intimacy with a person that brought it out.
Sticking with that poem, the self-portrait, for a moment, I was struck, and maybe I hadn't read the poem recently enough to have remembered this, but the opening stanza seems to owe so much to Elizabeth Bishop's poem, The Map, her first poem. And there's another poet who we think was not particularly engaged in social or political questions, but in a very deep way, and certainly with regard to ecology, she was, in the same way that Merrill was. And of course, they admired one another. They admired each other enormously and learned from each other.
Oh, of course. I mean, the first place I think I read James Merrill's name, unless I saw it at age 6 or something, was on the back of Elizabeth Bishop's collected poems, where he's written a gorgeous blurb for her that, in retrospect, he makes her poems sound like a non-renewable resource. He says something like, "They're the poems I love best, and there will be no more." The poem Willard mentions is called "The Map." It's the poem that a 20-something Elizabeth Bishop wrote, I think on New Year's Eve. So she must not have been out at a party. But it shows her worldview as she just won't be a historian of the emotions. She'll be a map maker of the emotions. And I do think that Merrill is playing on that. He's then just giving it his extra, I don't know, postmodern twist by making his map, I don't know, a Tyvek plastic that won't degrade even thousands of years after we do.
And of course, he may have been legally obligated to do this, but I don't think that was his primary motivation. But for me, the real charm of the title is that TM in parentheses, because that would alert him, or that would show us that he is alert to certain kinds of advertising lingo, and the Tyvek is like Kleenex. It is a trademark, and you can't say it without putting the TM in, though I bet he could have gotten away with it if he had wanted to.
I've learned, I mean, I thought this already, I know it now, I'm in this house. There's no level of language that's below his noticed. That he could have fun even with the TM that we all take for granted. So yeah, I think he was really happy to have that in there.
And I will take one more question, which occurred to me at the very beginning when you were talking about the boundaries of your project, as we used to say in the academy, your project, about I's and we's. For me, the greatest articulation of that impulse comes from a poet whom Merrill did not much care for, and that was Wordsworth, of whom he once said that he picked up the prelude in his 40s and fell asleep after 10 pages, and that was the end of that. But I always remember the great lines from the first third of Tintern Abbey, a long sentence that begins with, "Nor less I trust to them I may have owed another gift of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is light." And it goes on, the sentence, having started out with I, nor less I trust, I may have owed, till even the motion of our human blood, almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. That's one 15-line sentence that goes sort of tentatively from nor less I trust, I may have owed, to the certainty of we see into the life of things. So the poet of the egotistical sublime has not just taken it upon himself to speak for everybody, but has proved the way in which a halting beginning can lead to an assertive, resonant, plural ending. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, and I will have to steal it from you for the book's introduction. The question of who you speak for in a poem when you move from I to we, it appears throughout poetry history, and even before English poetry history. But at each stage of it, the question of what gives you the right to speak for someone else, what makes it true, what makes it beautiful, what makes it accurate, all of those change. It turns out that even though, as I've said, when we teach lyric poetry, we often speak of the I, it turns out that many poems that go viral, that become big in the last few decades, speak for many people, whether it's about the war in Ukraine, about climate change, about police brutality, about the poems I've talked about today. And I think now it maybe seems more of a trickier thing today. We know we're not supposed to, in polite society, I don't know, you don't order at the table for everyone. You let them do it. Unless you do something they don't.
These things have all kinds of registers. And I remember so strongly, because I'm a million years older than you, that in formal writing, when I was in school, I, were never allowed to say we and I. You were writing a critical paper. One notices, one sees, one does this. That's how it was written. And then it was so terribly liberating at a certain point when I realized I could say, we see, which of course is just a fiction. We see this, we see that, we know that. And then the greatest liberation of all is when in a formal paper, one could say, I. This is what I think, which you were not allowed to say in a formal analytical paper 50 or 60 years ago.
That's funny. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm now at the Harvard Society of Fellows, where I get to meet brilliant scholars in any number of disciplines. And in many other academic disciplines today, you're still supposed to speak for we and not I. I've met many mathematicians who have different theories. I wish I could remember his name, but there's a now deceased mathematician who just says not to use we, because then it will lead to ridiculous sentences like, we thank our wife for making we while we worked on the paper.
Well, we won't even get into the occasion, because we don't have many minutes left, to talk about pronouns in contemporary discourse. I mean, you do the now, I don't know whether it's common or expected, but your signature says he, him. And there are other people who do not identify as he, him, but they, them.
Sure. The first poet I look at, Adrienne Rich, she in the 80s wrote an essay about what she called the political problem of ordinary pronouns. And in that, as in a few other things, I think she, was a bit ahead of the time. I think now we take it for granted.
Diving into the wreck is a poem about androgyny in costume and in plurality of identity.
Sure.
So we, they, I can't remember the last lines. We are plural.
Yeah.
One of the people out there in cyberspace asks a good question for the end of the show, unless there are more down here, which I don't think there are. How do your other artistic practices, of which I know there are at least several, perhaps even many, inform your poetry and vice versa?
It's a good question. I have to say now as a warning that as someone whose job is to review and analyze and think about other people's poems, I'm pretty dim at talking about my own. I am not my own best critic. The main way it affects my poetry is my first artistic love before poetry is music. And it's still, if poetry brings me up here, music brings me all over the place. And many of my poems have been inspired by both popular and classical and jazz music. Phrases, feelings, moments, histories. So that's the main way, is I've copied a lot from my playlist.
The same might be said for James Merrill.
Oh, sure.
On that,
I'll say I'm right outside from his record room, which is, again,
right. On that happy note, I think we should stop, because we're just at the hour mark. I think this has been delightful and informative.
Me too.
And thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
And the people out there, those who are within walking distance, stop by on Tuesday, the 29th of November, if there is still space available, and come to drink and listen to and write with and jaw with and enjoy with Christopher Spaide. Okay? Okay, bye-bye.
So, hi.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Bergen. It is lovely to see the James Merrill hidden study of 107 behind you. It's very nostalgic.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So this is my new book. It's called The Math Campers.
My own novel. It's called These Women.
It looks like this.
Well, the first thing I'll say is all the dreams are actual dreams. There's nothing worse than a fabricated dream. You can always tell.
I normally don't write in first person because of the fact that as soon as you have a narrator, you tend to have somebody listening, or there's an implied audience.
I just got to soak up in the atmosphere in that house. You just feel like a writer, and you feel like you're part of this tradition and a community, and it feels like the work is important.
Magical things happen when you're looking at Meryl's books.
Well, it was a really, really transformative residency for me. It might sound like a bit of an overstatement, but it really wasn't.
Meryl's really distinct imagination was present in every detail.
Thanks, Brendan. Bye. Enjoy Stonington on my behalf.
The first writers in residence came to the James Merrill House 25 years ago, shortly after James Merrill's death in 1995. Since then, over 80 writers have visited, staying in his home, a National Historic Landmark, to work on projects of their own. Thanks to Merrill's generosity, the house now belongs to the Stonington Village Improvement Association and is an ongoing inspiration for writers and poets from around the world. For more information, visit our website, jamesmerrillhouse.org. Thank you.